This graph represents supply and demand in an economy. The positively sloped line in red represents supply, while the negatively sloped line in blue represents demand. The concept of demand is different from the concept of aggregate demand in that regular demand represents the general want for and willingness to buy a product or service by the population. As a product becomes more scarce, the demand for it will increase, where demand will decrease when a product becomes more readily available. Aggregate demand, however, is demonstrated here by this blue negatively sloped line. Where regular demand represents the population's general desire for a product, aggregate demand is the total demand for all final goods and services in the economy at a given price level, the variable represented by the y-axis. As real GDP increases, aggregate demand decreases and the price level does as well. Here, I've introduced both the short run and the long run aggregate supply curves. The short run being the positively sloped red line, and the long run being the vertical black line which intersects the current equilibrium point, or the point at which the economy is currently operating. As price level increases, short run aggregate supply does as well, as suppliers will have more incentive to sell their products since they will receive more money for them. Alternatively, the long run aggregate supply curve is vertical, rather than sloped positively or negatively, as it represents the ideal location of the equilibrium point. In the diagram I've drawn, the economy is producing at the optimum output level. Aggregate demand is determined by 4 components: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. The sum of all of these measurements will indicate the aggregate demand, often represented by the formula C plus I plus G plus NX. Consumption is the measurement of demand by consumers in the population. Investment is the buying of physical capital, such as new machinery and tools, along with purchasing of stocks. Government spending includes public infrastructure like highways, as well as funding for social services like Social Security. Net export is the measure of net income produced by exporting goods to other countries and nations. 3 components of aggregate demand, consumption, investment, and net exports, are each affected by a particular economic variable. Consumption is a function of disposable income, meaning the value of consumption is directly related to the money consumers have left to spend after they pay taxes. Investment is directly related to interest rate, as the interest rate affects how much it costs to borrow money, and thus investment will fall when interest rates rise. The value of net exports is a function of exchange rate, as a changing exchange rate changes the value of domestic currency compared to foreign currency, which means exports can either get a nation more or less money than they did before the interest rate last changed. Like aggregate demand, aggregate supply also has determinants which come in the form of variables in society. All positive changes will cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to move to the right, while negative changes will push it toward the left. Changes in the wages for employees, such as an increase in minimum wage, can increase cost of production and thus cause a decrease in aggregate supply, or vice versa. Technological progress and innovations can increase productivity and thus cause an increase of aggregate supply. Changes in the labor force, such as an increase or decrease in available workers, can also affect productivity, as more viable workers will be, theoretically, able to produce more. Several changes in the economy can cause a leftward or rightward shift in the aggregate demand curve. Here, the curve has shifted to the left. This means that the total quantity of all goods demanded at any given price level has decreased. A decrease in any component of aggregate demand, consumption, investment, government spending, or net exports, will lead to a leftward shift of the curve. Here, the aggregate demand curve has shifted to the right. This means that the total quantity of all goods demanded at any given price level has increased, the opposite of what is indicated by a leftward shift. Where a decrease in any of the components of aggregate demand leads to a leftward shift of the curve, an increase in any of those components leads to the rightward shift seen here. As you can see, the aggregate demand curve is negatively sloped. This indicates that as price level decreases, there will be more demand for a product. This makes sense, as people will be more likely to buy cheaper products. The negative slope of the curve, therefore, is primarily determined by what is known as the wealth effect. This means that as price level in the economy decreases, consumers have more purchasing power. This increase in purchasing power increases both personal wealth as well as motivation to consume. It is for this reason that the aggregate demand curve gets longer, indicating an increase in aggregate demand as price level decreases. Here, we see the positively sloped short-run aggregate supply curve. This positive slope is due to the sticky wage theory. The sticky wage theory explains that wages for many workers are set by contracts that cannot be changed quickly when the economy changes. Hence, the wages set by the contract are sticky, as in they get stuck in one place for a while even though the economy is changing. So, if we remember what I stated on the previous slide, an increase in price level decreases purchasing power. So, price level increases but wages don't adjust because they're sticky. This means each employee has less purchasing power, meaning wages have effectively fallen, which means it's now cheaper for companies to hire labor. As a result, more labor is hired and output increases. Wages are said to be determined by supply and demand in an economy. Workers in the labor force sell their labor, so if there are less available workers in the labor force, the ones that are available will be able to charge more for their labor. The workers will be able to charge even more as the demand for workers increases. In this, wages are determined nearly identically to the prices of products in a store. As supply decreases, demand will increase and prices will rise. Another factor that plays into the determination of wages is the skill set of workers. A better trained, more competent worker will demand higher wages, as he or she will be more capable of increasing output and productivity. Employers and workers eventually settle on an equilibrium wage rate, based on the number of available workers, the demand for them, and their skill sets. Paulie Rosenzweig for President 2016 finna y'all.